Welcome, everyone, to our inaugural quarterly National Speakers Series. So at Pro Housing Pittsburgh, we're obviously focused on policies that will promote housing abundance and affordability in the Pittsburgh region specifically. But the housing crisis is, of course, a nationwide crisis. And the ideas and solutions to solving that crisis come from places outside of Pittsburgh, shockingly enough. So the purpose of this quarterly series is once a quarter, we're going to invite someone who has either written extensively or done important policy work on housing affordability or zoning or parking or anything related to any of that. And to kick us off, our inaugural speaker is Joe McReynolds, who is the co-author of Emergent Tokyo, Designing the Spontaneous City, which is this fantastic book about what policies led Tokyo to becoming one of the top urban centers in the world. And hopefully we can learn from this talk some lessons that we can apply to Pittsburgh. Joe's going to speak for however long he wants to speak for. And then after that, we're going to have a Q&A. So with that, Joe, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. So thank you so much for the intro, Jack. And yeah, I'm Joe McReynolds. I am a co-author of the book Emergent Tokyo, but I'm also an American YIMBY, essentially. I'm like a lot of you. I got into studying cities because I was looking at the challenges that our cities are facing, and I wanted to understand if there was a better way from some of my favorite cities around the world. I will not waste anyone's time. I will give you a starting point, bottom line up front. Here's what I think you can learn from Tokyo, specifically if you're an American housing advocate. First off, you build lots of housing, prices stay reasonable. That's it's a thing we always say, and Tokyo is a perfect example of how it's working in practice. Tokyo built a fantastic amount of housing compared to other cities in the developed world, and as a result, you just haven't seen the same skyrocketing rents. And a huge part of that is that zoning is handled at the national level such that by right, you want to build housing somewhere, you probably can. Now, that said, I mean, national zoning, is that possible in a US context? Probably not. Nor would it, not politically possible. In constitutionality, I doubt it. But at the very least, we can talk about state level zoning as an antidote to local NIMBYism. Tokyo is definitely an example of that. Another huge thing is that when you look at Tokyo, you see stuff in Tokyo that's YIMBY and it works great. You see stuff in Tokyo that's NIMBY and it works great. You see stuff in Tokyo that's socialist and it works great. You see stuff that's libertarian and it works great. You also see stuff that's could be classified as each of those that works poorly sometimes. The lesson being that our political battle lines in the US are just fundamentally an outgrowth of our housing scarcity. And if you were to move into a future without just endless housing scarcity, you'll probably start to see a lot of battle lines reconfigure in urban politics. So do not imagine that we have the recipe in kind of the YIMBY movement in America for flourishing, thriving cities every single step of the way. We're on step one, which is build enough housing that people have reasonably affordable places to live. And when we clear that hurdle, a lot of things may get more complicated. I still think there's tons of great reasons to be a YIMBY if you look at Tokyo, even beyond housing scarcity. But it's more simple than just we know we're right and we need to find the ammo to show the NIMBYs why we're right. It's more shades of gray than that. And I came to this topic. I came to urban studies from an odd place. I'm an intelligence analyst by training and by trade. I started building a side life for myself about 5 years ago to become an urban studies professor as well. But I try and bring an intelligence analysis perspective to looking at cities rather than a strictly an academic or a sociological or an architecture perspective. And as an intelligence analyst looking at cities, I started developing just a few questions that I asked about anything interesting or unusual I came across in Tokyo. I asked, why was this built? I asked, how does it continue to exist? Like, why has this interesting, unusual urban space not been turned into a Starbucks? And can these unique features of Tokyo, can they survive and continue to survive into the future? And that's the same set of questions is useful, walking down the street here in New York. If I encounter an indie bookstore, for example, in a very high price area, I'm these questions you can ask again and again, and the answers will hopefully be interesting and offer lessons for how to build a flourishing city in the future that emulates some of Tokyo's best qualities. Um, and what not to do, however, is to say, well, the Japanese are so blah blah blah. They're so polite, they're so communal. And the flip side of that is saying, well, we could never this, we could never that, because it's so different over there. A lot of the cultural stereotypes that you hear in popular media about Japan, if you go back a century, the stereotypes about Japanese people were totally the opposite. Like, oh, everything is dirty and chaotic, nothing's reliable, nothing's on time, can't trust anything. Like, did Japanese culture totally change over the course of a century? No. Ultimately, things that we can tell a lazy just so story about are really questions of public policy and a whole layers upon layers of choices, microeconomic, historical, um, policy, regulatory, you name it. So do research on why things are the way they are. And I'd a great conversation with Jack when I was seeing him in Chicago a little bit back, where Jack's clearly someone who has done a ton of research on questions of housing and urban policy, and that just that warms my heart because yes, it's important to organize, and when you organize, you tell a story and get people to buy into that story. But it's also important to have detailed, granular understandings of why things work the way they are, what interest groups are taking what positions on NIMBY issues and for what reasons, versus just well, they're all just selfish boomers who hate progress, that sort of thing. But now, talking about beyond just housing scarcity, lessons for the world from Tokyo that I think are relevant to trying to build flourishing cities across the United States. First, flexible micro spaces, and I'll talk more about what micro spaces are in a second, are absolutely essential. If you want your city to be more interesting and livable and intimate and communal and connected, micro spaces are the key. Second, zoning policy. And we'll talk beyond just about allowing housing and zoning, some of the more subtle lessons from Tokyo that make a massive difference in how a city can feel. And third, all landlords are not created equal. Different types of landlords lead to very different cityscapes. And by what types of landlords your city encourages, I don't mean in a sense of letting politicians favor one guy and disfavor another, and that kind of rent seeking. I mean, in the sense of, are various policies and regulatory, you name it, are they set up to encourage large numbers of small landlords, or are they set up to encourage small numbers of large landlords? That is often a big factor. And then finally, as I just explained, good ideas can come from anywhere. And if someone is telling you a story about how we can never learn from some other city that's doing great in the world, because their culture, their country is so different than ours, I would say be very skeptical. Now, first off, microspaces. In Tokyo, there are a few different kinds of microspaces, but if you look at the top left and bottom left there, you're seeing all these kind of neon signs and stuff. Not really neon these days, actually LED, but we call them neon. And each of those signs is pointing to a little space. And that space could be commercial. In some cases, it could be private. It could be a bar, a restaurant, a boutique, a workshop, a studio, you name it. But it could also be housing. Micro spaces are just small, flexible spaces in your city. And we're not used to thinking of micro spaces as a unified concept, because American cities are set up to produce very few of them. Everything from regulation to minimum unit sizes, fixed regulatory costs for businesses that don't scale, all designed to mean that you have to go big, especially with anything commercial, in order to not lose your shirt. And then on the top right, you have here a favorite little bar alleyway. Those are just shacks from the 1950s black market period that just built in an alleyway, that now they host 2-seat bars. And when you don't have serious issues with liquor licensing, with all sorts of the other business startup challenges in a city, you can just have a 2-seat bar in a shack in an alleyway, and it's honestly really nice. That's at an extreme example of, we're not going to get alley shack bars approved in American cities anytime soon, but it's a case study of something that people see, and they kind of associate with the developing world, and they assume that a city that develops to a certain level of economic clout and economic progress has to leave that behind. But you don't necessarily. You can simply let people continue doing things with spaces. And then the bottom right is very interesting. These are all residences, but these are, in Japanese they say tempo heiyo dutaku, which means combined shop residences. The bottom floor of the shop is, or the bottom floor is a shop, or it can be a restaurant, bar, anything, and then someone lives up above it. Maybe the proprietor, but not necessarily always. And that is something that, is kind of, we think of as an old-timey American Main Street thing, but there's no particular reason that has to just be in the past, and there's no particular reason that has to just be on one main street in a town. That can be a whole different mode of thinking about neighborhoods. So 3 major types of neighborhood of microspace in Tokyo. One are yokocho districts, and those are kind of horizontal microspaces, lateral microspaces. You have these row houses with many different little bars and restaurants sliced up between them on a narrow alleyway. And a lot of them they've been people have tried to evict them in Tokyo because they are sitting on some of the most valuable land on the planet. They are sitting on land right next to some of the busiest train stations in the world, where a gleaming skyscraper would be worth tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. But they are being used for ramshackle bar and restaurant districts because that's what they've always been. And land usage rights in Tokyo are actually, property rights are incredibly strong. So that there's no real eminent domain process that can force them out. So you had in the 80s, in the bubble economy, you had major real estate developers actually allying with the Yakuza, Japanese organized crime, to try and push out these bar districts. But they have done everything in their power to preserve the intimate culture of these bar districts and resist redevelopment, which you could call a NIMBY success story in one sense. But in a city full of abundant housing, where this incredible cultural heritage would just be replaced by a random skyscraper, it's honestly you end up rooting for essentially the NIMBYs, except no one in Japan is thinking of it as NIMBY versus YIMBY because, again, the battle lines are different. And then you have Zakyo buildings. You may have seen images of Tokyo, even if you've never been there. That's this like iconic neon nightlife, the buildings with all the neon up the outside, and each thing is a different business that you could visit. But no one really knows what they're called, and even in Japanese, no one really writes about them much. But they're really essential to the architectural character of the city, and they're Zakyo buildings. And this is something that we often could do in America. It's simply a question of Americans are not used to commercial stuff going past, say, the first and second floors. They're used to that being offices or residences, and so people don't look up as much. But there's also the signage question of our signage regulations are not designed to accommodate Zakyo buildings, and so we don't have them. But it just dramatically alters the number of little businesses that you have in a district. Like, as I showed in the image below there, you can fit 80 different small businesses in a single little 10-story tower if you want to. And that is they a lot of them grew up in the 60s and 70s in Tokyo, but property developers in Tokyo still build them because you can do interesting things with small lots, and they're good practice for their more junior developers before moving on to bigger real estate projects. But yeah, my hope one day is that we could restructure things like zoning to allow Zakyo buildings to come to America. Talking to developers and urban planners in Los Angeles, for example, they were talking about new ways of doing liquor licenses especially for things like food markets, where, say, one liquor license could cover a ton of micro businesses in a single property, and that could make a Zakyo building much more economical if they can serve you a $5 bottle of beer. That's a big part of how a lot of micro businesses are able to stay afloat financially. But then in American cities, liquor licenses are these challenging, prized things that we charge incredible money for. There are so many ways at different levels of regulation that Tokyo makes it easy for people to run little mom and pop small businesses that aren't making a ton of money, or at least not losing too much money. And a big part of that is people are encouraged by regulation, if not intentionally, to operate small businesses out of the bottom floor of their house.
Let's talk about Japanese zoning, because that's really comes to the fore when we're talking about these micro spaces. especially in the bottom floor of homes. So Japanese zoning is hierarchical, and what I mean by that is there are 12 zones, and with the exception of exclusively industrial zones at one end, if you're it's essentially levels of nuisance, and if you're at nuisance level 4 in terms of zoning, you can do anything nuisance levels 1 through 4 there by right. So it's dramatically simplified zoning compared to the U.S. system, and it has to be in order to be handled at the national level. This is really the most important thing for those mom and pop businesses, is that even the most residential zoning in Japan, absolute most residential, allows you to operate in the bottom floor of your house by right, allows you to operate a small bar, restaurant, workshop, boutique, you name it, gallery, studio. And that just completely changes the character of neighborhoods, of urban communities, especially when you combine it with transit infrastructure that makes it workable and walkable to get between neighborhoods. And then also combined with neighborhood layouts that are not designed around cars for the most part. You have large arterial roads that are car friendly, but then neighborhood streets are relatively car unfriendly. So you walk in the interior block of a Japanese neighborhood, and it'll be this maze of houses, of little small businesses, you name it. And at lunchtime, you might see grandmothers selling bento boxes out of their house, and you can do that in terms of small business and health regulations and things like that. There's just an incredible degree of freedom for people to act in their local environment and shape it into a place that feels intimate and personal and communal, rather than the way that American cities, even at their most developed, often feel like kind of everywhere and nowhere. You have this kind of sleek blandness, or at the lower end, a run down blandness. But yeah, allowing people to pursue personal passion, small businesses in the bottom floor of their house is honestly the single biggest change I think that American cities could make to bring some of Tokyo's energy to the US. Yeah, so just to reiterate again, with the way that hierarchical zoning works, of these 12 zones here, you can build housing by right in 11 of them. That is pretty huge. And that housing can be as part of a mixed use building, it can be exclusively housing. You can just build housing. And that I think, if we're talking specifically the housing agenda, that is honestly the biggest takeaway is are there big swaths of your city that you can't build housing in? And if so, can that zoning be changed? And then talking quickly about landlords, I mentioned at the beginning that I think it really matters what kind of landlords you have, and that's I've noticed both in Tokyo and in New York here, small landlords just make very different decisions about their tenants when it comes to are they trying to maximize return on their property? Are you just a line on a spreadsheet to them? Or are they having other considerations, idiosyncrasies that would allow them to host a say an interesting but money losing small business, or be open to kind of housing that isn't strictly developed to absolutely maximize profit potential, and that's something where in the U.S. YIMBY movement, where we're generally overall pretty favorable towards developers, which then means corporate landlords, because that's who's going to build the housing. But especially when you allow more flexible uses of existing housing, there is a lot to be said for small landlords that have a personal stake in their community, and which are willing to, let's say, beloved local businesses stick around, even if those local businesses are not the single most economically efficient use of a space. And in Tokyo, that really came about from the black market period, especially post World War II. Tokyo completely devastated, and then you had all these small marketeers starting up, selling goods outside of the rationed system. And then when that system was finally shut down by the powers that be, rather than just saying, well, you're all criminals, they said, oh, you kind of got the spirit, and you're just going about it the wrong way. We'll give you all tiny little stalls in these new market districts. And so just by fiat created a huge profusion of small landlords. And then in the devastated neighborhoods of Tokyo, they didn't really have the money to carry out the proper redevelopment plan for the city of Tokyo after World War II. So they kind of left people to their own devices to redevelop their neighborhoods in a ramshackle way. And you ended up with people, just a huge number of small landowners in the city through that. You also have a lot of pressure to break up moneyed estates. Inheritance taxes is actually a big one. At various points in modern Japanese history, you've had inheritance taxes over 50%, and those taxes have to be paid in a lump sum upon the death of the patriarch. So you would see properties get divided up, and again, no minimum lot size, and then divided up again, just so that you can sell half of the property to pay the inheritance tax. And over time, that leads to a more and more finely grained cityscape. And then also, I will say there's a huge amount of private development by railway developers in Tokyo in a way that used to exist in train suburbs in the US a century ago, but died off here during the automobile boom. But in Tokyo, they diversified enough into shopping and tourism and other things that during the automobile boom of the 60s and 70s, they were able to hang on and survive and thrive. And so now a huge percentage of that massive Tokyo railway network that everyone hears about is run by a dueling private megacorps. And they control not only the suburban train line, but they also control the suburban communities around their stations. They have shopping malls built over the stations, so they have huge commercial interests. They control the sort of weekender tourism destinations at the very end of their suburban train lines. Kind of a total system. Some of them run zoos. Some of them have affordable childcare subsidiaries to make their railway suburbs comparatively more attractive to families who are dual income compared to their competitors. There's just so many interesting possibilities that arise from having a number of competing megacorps running a big part of your transit network. And then they all meet up in a central kind of loop in Tokyo that's run by the city. So yeah, a whole lot going on with Tokyo's unique landlord mix that makes me start to think about possibilities for American cities similarly. But at the same time, we can't replicate that landlord mix. So it's a question of are there ways at the margins that we can encourage more fragmentation of landlords, or at the very least, landlords that are not strictly just in real estate and in the business of collecting checks on sleek buildings, but actually in the business of developing real communities, developing cities outward with connected transit potentially, things like that. Well, yeah, Shibuya, the famous district with the crossing you've probably seen in movies, is an interesting case study of the landlord mix in Tokyo. You have huge mega development leading up to the Olympics that didn't end up happening, and then at the same time, in the back alleys of Shibuya, you still have all that kind of like intimate, ramshackle local culture. My favorite, that picture in the bottom left there, is Nonbe Yokocho, literally drunkard's alley, on some of the most valuable real estate on the planet. And the mix of the two is actually kind of a beautiful thing that even major architects and developers have started taking lessons from the back streets for their corporate developments. And on the bottom right there, you have a neo yokocho that tries to learn from those traditional yokocho alleyways in the basement of a shopping mall development, and so trying to apply the same kind of spatial intimate pattern logic. So I think it is possible to have a synthesis between these kind of different cityscapes, and that it's not just a question of choose one or choose the other. And next slide. Yeah, so just finally wrapping up, because I think we're at about 45 minutes. I'm not saying Control C, Control V Tokyo onto an American city. I realistically do not think that is possible. But at the same time, there are a lot of different ways to skin a cat. And there are outcomes in Tokyo that I think we could reach through very different means. So that I personally find exciting to think about. That is then zoning especially is one that we're all focused on, but I'm really interested in liquor licenses for like micro businesses. And I'm also interested in cottage food rules. For those who've never heard the phrase cottage foods, those are foods that you can prepare in your home for sale without needing to basically comply with all the city's requirements for a full-on commercial kitchen. And usually there are things like cookies in there, the stuff that nobody wants their PTA bake sale being criminalized. So you see that stuff on there. But you also usually find things like tamales, for example, in Salvadoran neighborhoods, because there are cultural foodways that voters do not want criminalized. You don't want your local tamale guy to be thrown in jail. And so those regulations, we could widen that outward. You could see how it could be a political winner to add other heritage foodways to that cottage foods list. And then suddenly you start to get, the little old lady able to sell her bento boxes at lunchtime out of the ground floor of her house to an audience of appreciative local teleworkers. And suddenly you start to have little street life community more than you did before. So these are the kinds of things I'm thinking about when I think about American cities learning from Tokyo. Obviously, I would love for us to have, incredible trains and abundant housing, but to the extent those are kind of beyond my pay grade. Those are not something that I can make a good PowerPoint presentation and then suddenly the politics of housing changes. I'm looking at the stuff that can be kind of snuck in through the back doors. And so with that, we'll turn it over for questions.
I'm curious just about how accessible these spaces are in Tokyo, at least the first floor spaces, and how can you promote smaller businesses and these micro businesses while also like not having them somewhat accessible, but not having maybe all the burdens of like the ADA, which obviously we shouldn't get rid of and is good. But maybe you could talk a little bit about how, like I said, how accessible these spaces are.
So I think ADA, disability access in general, is a serious weak point in Tokyo. Tokyo is getting better, but it is not on America's level when it comes to disability access. And yeah, when you are asking people to allow more flexible uses of spaces, sometimes that is going to mean that you have spaces that are not fully ADA compliant being used as commercial businesses. And I think the closest thing to an American adaptation of that is that right now we do allow, I think, in some home businesses, we do allow people to run home businesses that in ways that are not strictly the same level of ADA compliance as commercial facilities. Things like in-home hair services. I'm maybe wrong, but I'm pretty sure that you can offer in-home hair services in the places in American cities where that's allowed without your home needing to be fully ADA compliant in every sense. And so that may point a picture for the future where you have still solid levels of disability access. If you're ground floor, if you're operating on a ground floor in a two-story row house, something like that, it should be fairly straightforward to make that a relatively accessible space. And so I don't think you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater of just all or nothing. But it does seem like there could hopefully be gradations, at least before thinking through the urban politics side of it, just in a practical sense. You could make spaces relatively accessible.
Thank you. I'm going to unmute Vlad. He has a question.
Hello. I was curious are any cities that you know of like doing anything interesting in this regard? Releasing unusual zoning, allowing for micro businesses, anything like that?
It's funny, in my day job, I'm very focused on studying the Chinese military, and so I'm very up to date on what stuff the Chinese military is doing. And then someone asks me, what's the American military doing? You work for America. What's the American military doing? And I'm just kind of drawing a blank because I don't really look at our side. And so too, in my other side career, I am way less versed than I would like to be in what American cities are doing that's interesting, innovative in this regard. I hear plenty of the horror stories from people. I think we all hear them on Twitter, but I'm definitely not the guy to ask about what innovative experiments are happening in American cities. I would love to find out if other people know stuff in this regard. Please, get on the mic, chime in. I would love to hear more.
Gotcha.
Cool. There's a question in the chat from Adam, so I'll read it. I'm wondering if you have any understanding of how the technical nature of Japanese zoning has led to their urban success, let's call it. For example, I've read that the required ratios among land uses, public facilities, and transportation in Japan are strictly defined, or at least more strictly defined as compared to the US.
So I don't know about ratio of land uses specifically. That one I'm not sure on, but the on the other two, I think definitely transportation is a huge component. Yeah, if you're talking about public facilities, I guess it depends how you define public facilities. Japan is not the greatest when it comes to trash cans, for example, or even public parks for that matter. But I would say this: when you have this national zoning code, it's most of Japan does not look like how one imagines Tokyo. A ton of roadside Japan across the vast swaths of Japan. It feels like, you could be in roadside Ohio or roadside Santa Fe, except for the language on the signs. So it's not that a zoning code alone has made Tokyo Tokyo-esque. There's plenty of car culture suburbs across Japan. It's the combination of zoning with the spatial configurations of transit and the city and things like that, and especially Tokyo is actually a very suburban city. That's the other thing is we think of Tokyo as being hyper urban, but it is extremely suburban. Huge percentage of Tokyo is living out in suburbs and commuting in every day. It's just rail suburbs rather than car suburbs, and that actually makes a massive difference in how a city operates and patterns of life, you name it. So I really do think you can get some of the positive qualities of Tokyo from the transit network. You can get some of them from zoning, but I really think it's the intersection of all these things that then is combined that is the ideal for producing those positive effects.
That's awesome. I'm curious if anyone else has questions. You can raise your hand. I'm wondering how do you think American cities can encourage smaller landlords, essentially, I don't know, ADUs, other small.
ADUs are a huge one. I see the American penchant for large backyards as kind of a positive, in the sense that I can imagine a world in which we take parts of those backyards and voluntarily start using them for more interesting things by being given the freedom to do whatever we want with them. If you give people the freedom ADUs are a great example. You give people the freedom to put an ADU back there, then some people will take it, and suddenly you have more housing density. A commercial example I can think of is there's a guy in South Central LA who I believe his name is Warren Bell, but he's essentially built a kind of an ADU off of his garage. But he's a blues musician, and he brings some of the most amazing blues musicians in the country to jam in his garage ADU. It's called Bell's Blues Garage. It's the only real juke joint in California. It's one of the best music venues anywhere in the country, I'd say. Just an incredible time. $10, all you can drink, all you can eat soul food. And that's is that strictly speaking legal? I don't exactly think so, but imagine a world in which that sort of thing is legal and encouraged, and you have even in a residential neighborhood like his is kind of, you know, classic California residential neighborhood. You have cool stuff springing up, and that's yeah. I think that ADUs are a big part of it, and letting people do more. You know, we don't have nearly as many row house owners in American cities as you would see in Tokyo, but we do have a lot of people with a lot of lawns that we could put things on.
I love that. That's inspirational.
Yeah, and if you guys are ever out in LA, Bell's Blues Garage, Sundays 6 p.m.
Let's see. We've got Vlad's got a question, I think. Go ahead,
Go.
Vlad.
Hey, hold on, I'm writing down this Bell's Blues Garage. And then I'll add also in LA, 106 Seafood Underground, which is this like guy that runs this incredible seafood restaurant out of his garage. Or I guess
106
garage.
Seafood Underground. That one is new to me. Okay.
That one is, I think it's in Inglewood, and it's not his, I said garage, but it's just like his backyard, and it's like a sizable place. It's incredibly good. So then I was also thinking like, so like I agree that, you know, allowing for like commercial activity and like live work stuff in the neighborhoods will like just naturally create an ecosystem that produces interesting things. But I feel like, do you see this sort of micro space type of, I'm wondering what set of circumstances in America would like make that situation where there's a lot of small businesses in one place. And I know also in LA there are a couple places like Plaza Mexico and
yeah. There's a new book out from the Chicago Architecture Center actually called Rebel Garages. Which a rebel garage is such an American term to put on a little, you know, small business out of your house. But it's actually a really cool book. I strongly recommend everyone check out Rebel Garages because it's a really interesting guide to, in Chicago, what people are already doing legally, semi-legally, illegally with their garages, which is in some ways a public-facing alternate entrance to your home that can be, you know, kind of easily separated out from your main house. I would be curious to, I haven't gone through in the book to check, but I'd be curious to see if there's like geographic clustering there, if there's some neighborhoods are more open to it than others. But that would be a place to look.
Okay, cool.
Thank you. And thanks, Vlad. Jack, I'm gonna unmute you.
First off, Joe, thank you so much for joining us, for being our inaugural speaker of this series. Just to end things, I've got 3 questions for you, which is, first is, if people want to learn more about your book or read your book, where can they find it?
You can find it on Amazon, or if you are in a city with an urbanist bookstore, it would really warm my heart if you got it from your local urbanist bookstore, because it's these days urban specialty bookstores are a relatively rare thing. I'm looking into how I might bring one to DC, but if not that, you know, by all means, go on Amazon. It's, if anything, Amazon it's finally back in stock there. For a while, it was out of stock on Amazon. So, but yeah, I'm just in general, I'm pretty easy to reach on Twitter and other places. And so if you have more questions or want to talk or ideas, you name it, just hit me up. I'm always interested in talking about this stuff with interesting people. So
Excellent. And then if people want to learn more about Japanese zoning and they've read your book or haven't read their book but want to learn more from sources that aren't your book, where should they go to learn more about Japanese zoning and possibly how they can apply it to the US?
There is a series by Ant Breach. Ant Breach is a guy at the Center for Cities in the UK. So I think spelled center the British way, like TRE. Center for Cities, if you Google like Ant Breach, Center for Cities Tokyo, he did a whole series of articles on what the UK can learn from Tokyo, especially in terms of housing and zoning. And they're quite good, and I mean it's the UK is a little different than the US, but I think it's every city, every state in the US is different from each other. So I think the big thing really is that kind of useful, clear explanation about why things work differently in Tokyo from most Anglosphere cities, and he gives you that in spades. So yeah, that's what I would recommend.
And then the third and final question is, if you were planning our speaker series, who would you really like to hear from? Who do you think gives a really good talk on anything urbanism related that you think that people need to hear?
That is a great question. I would invite Kim Mai Cutler, the author of back when she was a journalist at I think Verge or TechCrunch, one of those. She wrote a piece called "How Spotted Owls Lead to Vomiting Anarchists." That was, in some ways, the Kickstarter of the modern YIMBY movement in San Francisco. That piece changed a lot when it came out, and since then she's worked in kind of some housing related startups. I think she's done a lot. She's a venture capitalist at one point. She's done a lot of interesting things in addition to being a journalist who studied housing. So and just in general an interesting wonderful human being. I would strongly recommend Kim Mai Cutler as a speaker.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. If you joined in late and missed the earlier part of the talk, we're going to be posting it on YouTube. And after we've got it on YouTube, we're going to blast it on the blog as well, so you'll be able to find it there.
And last thing, I just want to say I learned apparently Carnegie Library branches have the book, so you can also check it out from your library.
Ooh, that's exciting.
All right, thank you, everyone. I'm going to end the meeting now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Right.
Bye.